Hi, everybody. I'm Christian Lucas. I'm a dentist, so I'm a practice owner in Staffordshire, in a cold squat practice, just a small single-handed surgery. But I also work as a visiting endodontist in a practice in Crewe. I'm an associate somewhere else, and I do some kind of 0 hours contract lecturing. And so, for me, the current situation has been fairly tricky, very murky in terms of where my employment status lies with regards to any government help and that kind of thing in terms of me being redeployed if needed by the NHS. So my brother, who is a HR consultant, has all of a sudden become very useful. And so we had a chat and decided that perhaps it would be something that we could share with the profession as a whole. So just to give you a little bit of a background as to his background. So Aaron's a HR consultant and he's been at the top level of HR. He's been in the HR profession for the last 15 years, providing consulting services to businesses around the world, including charitable organization, businesses, also financial sector, businesses and retail. And he's helped businesses such as Bupa, PepsiCo, and several multinational banks. So I'm assuming he knows what he's talking about. So we thought we'd get some questions together. So over the last few days or so, I've put a little shout out on some of the Facebook groups asking for people to give me their questions with regards to how the current situation affects their financial planning for their businesses, if they're practice owners, or if they're associates, how the current situation affects them as well. There's obviously a big scope in terms of different types of practices that people have, including private practices, mixed practices, mainly NHS practices. And there's one that was a mobile orthodontic unit, which I thought was fairly innovative as well, but we're all affected in different ways. So that's Amron. So perhaps we should just jump straight into some of those questions, Amron.
Yep, sounds good. Please go ahead.
So a friend from way back actually commented, Seema Sharma, she's looking to furlough some of her staff in the next few days. Now, I know she's got a few practices with different situations, but this was a question that came up over and over again, and it's the issue with mixed practices. There's a lot of practices that have two streams of income, private and NHS. Just to make everybody aware, Amron is not dental. He is human resource management, and so he's just going to give us the best that he can with regards to that. But a lot of these practices have dual income streams, NHS and private. And so the question that came up over and over again is that if I've got a certain percentage, say 30% of my income is NHS, 70% of my income is private, then can I furlough the 70% of my team in accordance with the proportion that is private income, and then keep on full-time 30% of the staff, and then still receive the NHS income as promised via NHS England for the contract?
Yeah, and I imagine that's a big question for a lot of people out there, particularly those who are getting dual funding, NHS and private as well. So I think, as you say, Christian, I'm not dental. I've got some experience in HR. Interesting to note, furloughing had very little, if any, meaning in UK employment law until this month, actually. And so this is kind of new for everybody. But effectively, the NHS are saying anybody who is receiving any funding from NHS right now, their intent is to use as many of their staff as possible. The government is saying that funding for furloughing is available for many businesses, but where at all possible, they're trying not to use that for public services. So wherever NHS funding is currently being given, it seems to me that the government are trying very, very hard to get as many resources from those organizations where they are providing funding to be redeployed and used elsewhere.
Yeah, so I guess that makes sense that the government's already appropriated certain funds for the public sector. They're trying to maximise the use of those funds. So I guess to answer that then, furloughing for mixed practices isn't really an option at this point.
Well, at this point, it seems that way. I think the British Dental Association are working with the government right now to figure out some flexibility on that, recognizing that yes, we do get some NHS funding, but not all of our funding is NHS. And how do we really come to an agreement on that? So right now, it seems that the regulations do not provide furloughing options for any kind of dental practice that is receiving any kind of NHS. But I'd watch this space because it seems like that's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, and I suppose that's going to really pinch and be really hard news for a lot of mixed practices. And so my advice would be to write to MPs, put some pressure on, make sure that you're in contact with the BDA as well to get that up-to-date information, so we can get maybe a little bit of traction with a movement to get that flexibility.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a few people that there's a lot of staff that are worried, especially nursing staff, reception staff, that they've been designated as key workers and as such are kind of eligible for redeployment if needed. So from a practice owner's point of view, the question really is if the NHS don't employ them, they're employed indirectly via a contract to the practice. And so from a human resources perspective, if the NHS try to then appropriate those staff or redeploy those staff, the NHS don't have a direct contract with them. So kind of legally, how does that leave those staff or the practice if the staff don't want to go? Or, can the NHS do that? Can they reach into your practice and take your staff in this particular situation? How does that work?
Yeah, and you mentioned a key word there, legally, and I can't provide any legal counsel or advice. So that where you come across questions that are legal questions, make sure you're reaching out and getting legal advice. Right now, I think it goes back to the kind of the answers we just gave on the last one, is the NHS are reaching just as deep and as far as they can to get some support wherever possible. And so they are kind of using this, if we fund you at all, as a bit of a hammer to crack that walnut, saying if we fund you at all, we're going to reach as far as we possibly can and get all staff to provide support and services to us. And should you not provide the details for those staff, then that could jeopardize your NHS funding. Now, that's not been finalized. There are ongoing conversations, but that's how it feels right now, that all staff are implicated in that.
Okay. And obviously the natural next question is if a staff member refuses to be redeployed. I know the language is softening at the moment with redeployment in the letters coming out from the Chief Dental Officer in NHS England. So if a member of staff refuses to be redeployed, would that negatively affect the income stream that a practice is getting from the NHS?
Well, from an HR perspective, if you find yourself in a situation where business continuity is difficult or impossible, and therefore puts your employees in a potentially redundant situation, or where you could potentially be making redundancies, one of the first things that an employer needs to do is look for alternative solutions. And what the government has done here is said, we will provide in many businesses this provision of up to 80% of salary for people to maintain their employment as far as possible, even if there's no work for them to do. Now, as we've said, in the NHS, the government have also said, we're not planning to give you that 80% because we're already funding some of the work that you're doing there, and we expect the workers to provide support to what we're doing. In other words, they're saying, we are not going to make you redundant. We've got alternative work for you to do, and we believe it's a reasonable alternative. Therefore, under normal circumstances, if you're in a redundancy situation and the employee turns down a reasonable alternative employment option, then they potentially could still be made redundant, but without redundancy pay.
Okay. So there's kind of there's no redress for that member of staff if they refuse that alternative employment.
If that's the route that the NHS are taking, and they're saying, we will stop to fund you if you don't do this, or even at the practice level, if the practice can't find alternative employment that they can afford to pay the worker for, redundancy really becomes the key option.
Yeah, which makes those discussions between VDA and the government really key at the moment, I suppose.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other thing, as we've said, it's fluid, it's new, and so we've got to keep an eye on what's coming out of those conversations.
Okay, so moving on then, somebody asked, can I furlough someone I've offered a job to prior to the outbreak, even though their contract doesn't start until May?
So the furloughing guidelines are really clear on this, that furloughing only applies to employees who are on the payroll as of the 28th of February 2020. So if they've not started yet, and if they started after that date, and assuming that we could furlough staff, they would have had to have been on the payroll by the 28th of February 2020.
Okay, so there's no prospective, only retrospective furloughing of staff, which
No.
I think that clearly makes sense. Otherwise, I'd be employing multiple family members and then
Absolutely.
not that I would do that, obviously. Right. So this was a really interesting question. I think somebody has been really bright and perhaps got some good advice about how to set up their company. This person asked, if I have a sole trader status that doesn't receive income from the government or through the NHS, can I furlough people as that I am employed through that sole trader status? I think the idea was that they split their company into two. One was a limited company part, one was a sole trader part. There's a certain amount of people that were receiving income through the limited company, and that was receiving money from the NHS, but the sole trader part was employing different people, and they were not receiving any NHS income. Is there the differences between that within the same practice?
So it would seem to me that if they're not receiving NHS income, that they fall under all of the other business models where the government have said that you can furlough staff if the work is not there for them to continue. The NHS have been very clear, where you are receiving any NHS funding, then that's where they want to reach in and use the employees and the workers available. So if where they've split that, the portion that's receiving the NHS income would obviously not be able to furlough employees. Those who are not receiving any NHS income, it seems to me that they would be open to receiving being able to furlough employees.
Good. So as long as you're not receiving any public funding, it seems like you would be eligible for the coronavirus job retention scheme, and that would work out even within the same practice, as long as it's structured in a way that your sole trader status isn't receiving any government income, and through that method you're employing other people.
Yeah, and it's, I think the government, I mean, personally speaking here, we're in a crisis. The government are doing all they can to make things happen and work the best that they can. And they've really gone out on a limb to say, hey, employers, we want to keep the economy going. We want to keep employees employed wherever possible. We want to make this as reasonable as we can. And they've said, we're not going to check all of these applications for furloughing right now. If there's a reasonable chance that you fit the criteria, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. However, what they have said is after the event, there's going to be a lot of auditing going on. And if they find that people have been untruthful in any sense, then they will claw back some of that furloughing money that they've given. So just make sure that when you are going to claim, that you are legitimately claiming, that you're falling under the right description of people who are able to claim for furloughed employees.
Yeah, and I think as well, because we've been in a situation where we've been applying for the small business grant. We're in a brand new startup practice, and so I guess again, when people are applying for grants, furloughing status, anything like that, just be aware, play by the rules, because they'll be looking, and that's the same, I suppose, for self-employed associates who need to be making sure that they are earning under £50,000 to apply for that furloughing grant, etc., or for the self-employed grant.
Yeah, the government have been very clear as to what the thresholds are, and I think part of that is that they will come and check afterwards. And obviously, we hope, given the environment that we're in, that everybody's going to play by the rules and do the best that they can to support everybody else.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Can company directors be furloughed and be considered for the COVID job retention scheme?
So this is an interesting one. I mean, as the answer to the question is yes, if the company's directors are paid as you earn. So if they're under the PAYE scheme, then they qualify for the job retention scheme, the COVID job retention scheme. If they are not, so if they are company directors but are receiving, let's say, a minimum income plus dividends, etc., that does not qualify them for the COVID job retention scheme.
Yeah. Okay.
So PAYE is the key there.
Yeah, okay. Good. Otherwise, it'd be going through, I guess, self-employed, and then having to prove that you were earning below £50,000.
Yeah, well, and actually it's a little bit different for the self-employed versus company directors who are receiving dividends. There is a separate scheme for self-employed. Currently, there's nothing for limited companies where directors are receiving dividends.
Okay, so there's another one where people are potentially falling through the cracks in terms of governmental support.
Exactly, at this stage.
Okay.
Yep.
There's a few cracks, it seems, at the moment that people are falling through. Okay, really, really good question. Can you furlough a staff member and then unfurlough them at the end of each month to do payroll and other duties? And then I presume the rest of the question would be that can you then refurlough them once they've done payroll?
Yeah, great question. And obviously really important for a number of people where work will come and go. How do we manage that? So there is a minimum period of time where an employee needs to be furloughed, or rather a worker needs to be furloughed. So the minimum amount of time is 3 weeks. They can then become unfurloughed if there's work that needs to be done, and they can become refurloughed, but again for a minimum of 3 weeks. There's no minimum time period, as far as I can tell, between periods of furloughing. But as long as you furlough for a minimum of 3 weeks before unfurloughing, then yes, that's possible. Critical there as well, Christian, is workers can't do any kind of work for that business or for that employer during the time that they are furloughed. So if it's a service or anything, they cannot do it because that puts them in jeopardy and puts the employer in jeopardy then of having that funding clawed back afterwards.
So you can't have practice management staff at home answering calls, doing emails, doing all the stuff that they would do anyway, but still receiving furlough fees.
Exactly right. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly right.
I think that's it. That's important to know as well. But I think that's again important to know that furlough status would only be for perhaps purely private practices or entities that aren't receiving government funding. So it's important.
And unless we hear anything, today, tomorrow, in the very near future from the government around that, you're exactly right.
Okay, good. Okay, I think we're getting to the end of the questions. And apologies to anybody that has submitted a question that has missed. I've tried to get as many. A lot of the questions were duplicated. So if we have missed one of your questions, then please email us. We'll give you some information afterwards with regards to that. So this last question, a staff member wishes to take unpaid leave to avoid risk of exposure to COVID-19 in possible redeployment. Can they do this?
So under normal circumstances, I would say, whatever the contract says and whatever the policies and processes are within the company, then yes, of course. Right now, it's not clear. The reason I say that is the NHS are saying that whilst we are funding you in any sense, we expect normal payments from you to your workers to continue. Therefore, they could argue that unpaid leave is not normal in the circumstances. And so there is an argument to say that this wouldn't work necessarily. And maybe I could just bolt onto that. Some questions have come up regarding, can employees take leave during this time, paid leave during this time? And the answer is very similar. We think the answer is yes. It's not being clarified 100%, but they should normally be able to take paid leave, and it's looking likely that the government will allow you to claim that as part of, if you're able to furlough employees, as part of the furloughing. But for those who are not able to furlough, then it would be, I guess, business as usual.
So I suppose from a business owner's perspective, in an ideal world, what you really want is to get people to take their paid holiday now, have the furloughing cover that paid holiday leave, and then that's consolidated all together, and that's okay. That's normal because that's within normal business practice. Then that's kind of legitimate practice to do that.
That's what it looks like right now. It's not confirmed 100%, and so again, I would put that probably, given the uniqueness of the environment, into one of those legal questions. Just get some double check on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would make sense if people are willing and wanting to take their holiday. HR, again, employment law is that if you want people to take paid leave, you need to give them twice the amount of notice of the time that you want them to take. So if you want them to take 5 days annual leave, you need to say, hey, 10 days from now, I want you to take 5 days leave. You can't do it tomorrow saying, I want you to start your leave tomorrow. You need to give them twice as much notice as the time that they are being asked to take.
And that, I think, is quite a useful piece of information, actually, given the amount of time that we are expecting this to last for. It could be that you want someone to take 2 weeks leave, but you might give them a month's notice, and we'll probably still be in this situation at the moment. So that is really useful. That's great. Now, I did say last question, but I got a question that I want to know from an associate's perspective, as I kind of fit into all of these categories. But from an associate's perspective, the NHS will be providing income for a practice. The associate, their employment status as it stands is that they're self-employed entities, almost subcontracting to the practice. So what protections do you feel that there are at the moment for associates? Is there are unfortunately some unscrupulous practice owners out there that might take the money from the NHS, lay off the associate and say, we're not going to pay you and there's no work for you to do. And then that income stream then, or the process by which the associate is paid, is broken by that practice owner. Yeah. Is that something that the practice owner should be very wary of, employing those kind of tactics?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to what I was saying before. There's a couple of things that we need to be aware of here. Number one is that there will be audits going on after the event. Right now, I think it's all hands on deck. And so, I mean, you've seen the government throw piles and piles of cash at this thing just to keep it moving. That doesn't mean they're not going to look back and find out what went wrong and really, I would imagine, come down quite hard on businesses that have tried to be unfair in the way that they've managed this. So I think that's a warning for employers and for practice owners. For associates, I think, again, they have the option, if they've had the conversation with the practice manager and they don't feel that they've got the information that they need or it's not satisfactory, then they can turn to ACAS, which is a conciliatory body. And you can find more information on ACAS on www.acas.org.uk, so acas.org.uk. There's a lot of information on there about employees' rights and workers' rights, and you can call and get free advice as to where to go next.
That's brilliant, because I know that practice owners are going to be coming under a lot of pressure for just basic business survival, and some of those things that are going to, they're going to rear their ugly heads in terms of decision-making processes. And I can see occasions where the practice might receive 80% of their contract because of the leeway for lab bills, and then they might then only pass on 40 or 50% to associates. Now, the ACAS procedure does give them area for kind of helping with the conflict between a practice manager if it can't be arranged locally first.
I mean, ACAS are an independent body, and so it's really worth reaching out to them if there are questions there that you don't feel that you're getting answered by the practice manager. If there is still a lot of questions around the honesty and the truthfulness of what's happening there, ACAS is really a great resource for that.
That's great. So just for any associates out there, if there's any kind of conflict between what you feel you should be receiving and what you are receiving in terms of what you normally get, which is what the NHS are trying to set up and protect, then that's a really good resource for you. Cracking. Right then, so thank you for all that advice. So just for those that are watching and think, actually, I've got some extra questions, we'll make Cameron's details available, and he's very, very kindly offered to answer people's questions as they come through. Hopefully this has been useful. I know it has been for me in our practice situation, and hopefully it's been useful for everybody else. Now, moving forward, Amron, is there any advice in terms of human resource structuring of companies moving forward after the crisis? Where would that come in?
Well, there's a couple of things actually which I think is important to consider right now. One is communicating with everybody, making sure that you're communicating with your employees, making sure you're communicating with your clients, making sure you're communicating with your suppliers, just being really clear about, hey, what's happening with you guys? This is what's happening with us. Keep everybody abreast for as far as possible. And I wouldn't try and sugarcoat any information either. I would be very honest and open with people and saying, hey, we don't know what the future looks like on this. But as far as suppliers are concerned, are you able to support us as we come through this? Do you have the resources to make sure that we know what we've got in the future? And if they don't, you need to be looking for alternative suppliers for providing your materials, etc. That's one thing. But as you come through this, I think it's important to recognize that we've heard it all. We're all in it together. And for those who are going to come through it are the ones who have really positioned themselves as doing something greater for a greater cause than just themselves. And so that communication piece is really important. Structuring yourself, I think, as we've said, Christian, you identified one of those practices who've got NHS funding on one side and private funding on the other side. That seems to be a wise way. I wouldn't want to advise that for everybody, but it seems to be a wise way, and it would be certainly worth considering. Effectively, crises will come up. We don't know when, we don't know what it will look like, but this is an opportunity to reflect and say, well, what really tripped us up? And what other ideas have we got that can help us prepare for the next one? So there's a couple of things there.
No, thank you so much. Like I say, if anybody's got any further questions, we'll put the contact details for Amron up, and he's happy to answer those questions. We really appreciate that as a sector for that, Amron. So again, Amron, thank you very much for your time and for your expertise, and hopefully we'll speak soon.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.